So when you get to your feet again, can you give us the month in which the hospital building will be finished, when it will be fitted out, complete and open and operational? And can you give us an absolute assurance that 2.2 billion is in fact the final cost, inclusive of any protracted processes through the courts?
Taoiseach, please.
Thanks, Deputy. The hospital will be open later this year, 2024. October is the target month, and it'll be open to patients in 2025. 2.2 billion is the maximum allocation made by the government for this project. We will not be allocating any more. 1.4 billion drawn down already, an additional 0.8 billion available to complete the project and commission it and open to children, and that will happen next year.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Ivana Bacik, please.
Taoiseach, the death toll in Gaza has reached more than 30,000 people. Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world, and under Israeli bombardment, its people have now been brutally displaced, forced into ever more cramped and overcrowded spaces, most recently into Rafah, and yet they're still being bombarded, even now in Rafah. Taoiseach, we're witnessing Armageddon. There is nowhere left for a desperate civilian population to go in Gaza. So on 7th October, we saw the horrific Hamas attack on Israel. And since 7th October, we have seen the loss of civilian life in Gaza on an unthinkable and unconscionable scale. In recent days, we've heard the heartbreaking audio of the last hours of 6-year-old Hind Rajab pleading for help, hours before she and her 2 rescuers were killed by Israeli fire, along with 5 members of her family. Taoiseach, back in October, the Dáil voted for a ceasefire, and in doing so, we were one of the first parliaments in the world to make that call. But while making calls is important, it's taking action that counts, Taoiseach. And as long as Ireland delays taking further meaningful steps to put an end to the genocide in Gaza, then our complicity in what is happening there is being prolonged. And there is so much more that your government can and should be doing. And you would have support from opposition in doing so. For The Independent today, Ellen Coyne writes that the Irish Strategic Investment Fund has invested more than €4 million in companies based in illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank, East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. And these illegal settlements, Taoiseach, represent the thin end of the wedge of the same policies of the Israeli government. Policies which have resulted in the slaughter of so many children in Gaza, children like Hind Rajab. And these Israeli government policies are breaching humanitarian law. They're displacing people from their homes, destroying families, destroying communities. And by enabling subsidising of businesses in occupied territories, Ireland is complicit. And that complicity, we know, does not chime with the values of people here in Ireland. So, Taoiseach, while I acknowledge your engagement on measures such as recognition of Palestinian statehood, it's not good enough to say wait a little longer, because how long must people in Gaza wait? The death toll is mounting, starvation is setting in, disease is spreading there. And so we in Ireland must move and must take further action. We must move on legislation to stop Ireland subsidising genocide, and we must move to end trade with occupied territories in Palestine. Your government has said you would prefer to take action on these issues by non-legislative means, but there are perfectly good bills waiting to be passed. And Taoiseach, I've received a legal opinion which indicates that the Occupied Territories Bill initiated by Senator Francis Black is possible to pass under EU law. So let's do it. Let's move to pass the Occupied Territories Bill. Will you commit to doing so? And at the next EU Council meeting, will you press for the suspension of the EU-Israel Trade Association Agreement? Taoiseach, we need to do more than call for a ceasefire. There is a solid view in this House on both sides that we need to take action now. We're hearing from so many people across the country their utter distress and horror at the genocide unfolding before our eyes. We cannot sit back and be complicit.
Thank you, Deputy Bacik. Taoiseach.
Deputy, I share your distress and I share your horror at the events that we're seeing unfolding in Gaza. The ground assault on Rafah should not happen. 1.5 million people are taking refuge there, most of them displaced already from other parts of Gaza, some displaced on more than one occasion. And there is a serious risk of a massacre occurring in Rafah if a ground assault were to occur. And that would be a gross violation of international law on top of all of the other violations of international law which Israel is responsible for. We were among the first countries in the world and among the first parliaments in the world to call for a ceasefire. That is correct. There is now a ceasefire proposal on the table. negotiated by Egypt, by Qatar and by the Americans. Both Hamas and Israel should accept that ceasefire offer, in my view. It will last for 3 months, will allow the hostages to be released, and they should be released, the killing to stop, and aid to get into Palestinian civilians. And then there's the possibility to build on that 3-month ceasefire, make it permanent, enable the removal of Hamas leadership and fighters from Gaza, and potentially new elections in Israel. In terms of the actions that we're taking, Deputy, we've taken many actions. We've increased funding for the UN and UNRWA in Gaza and in the West Bank when other countries have suspended their funding, incorrectly in my view. We voiced our position and voted in support of the Palestinian people in the UN and the EU. We have called for the EU-Israel Association Agreement to be suspended based on our view that Israel may be in violation of the human rights clause in that. I spoke to the European Commission President on that only yesterday. It does, however, require unanimity at EU level to do so, and there is not unanimity at EU level to do so, as you know. In relation to the International Criminal Court, the Attorney General will be in The Hague on February 22nd to make our case before that court in relation to Israel's ongoing occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. We'll certainly review what you've mentioned in relation to ISIF, in relation to trade, our advice from the Attorney General and indeed the previous Attorney General, and indeed I think the Attorney General before that, was that trade is very clearly an EU competence and is not in the competence of this Parliament to legislate for. But we do all need to be realistic, Deputy. These are the actions we're taking, and they're considerable, and we'll take more. And recognition alongside other countries is one of the things we're working on at the moment and discussing with other countries and other EU allies. It's very, very clear to me, though, Deputy, that Israel is not listening to any country in the world. I don't even think they're listening to the Americans anymore. They have become blinded by rage, and they are going to make the situation, I believe, much worse for their own security in the long term by going down the path they're going.
Well, Taoiseach, I certainly do acknowledge Ireland's response to the humanitarian disaster in Gaza has been strong, stronger than many other European countries, but it's still not strong enough. It was important that our government called for a ceasefire. It was important that you and your government colleagues defended UNRWA when other countries were not doing so, and we acknowledge that from opposition. And I'm glad to hear you spoke yesterday with the EU Commission President on the EU-Israel trade agreement. But we need to do more. And you've spoken before in this House on working with other like-minded states, European Union member states, on seeking to press further at EU level. So can you update this House on what actions are ongoing and what are the other EU member states with whom you're working? We understand Belgium may be one. Because now is the time for us to see further action being taken. And you've said Israel isn't listening. But Israel will have to listen if enough countries in the West currently supporting Israel withdraw support. And I'm thinking in particular of the US, and I'm thinking of EU countries with whom Ireland has influence. And it is possible for you and your government to use your influence to a higher and stronger degree, because otherwise we are all complicit, sitting watching an Armageddon unfold and children like young Hind Rajab continuing to die and continuing to suffer under our watch, under the watch of this world. So we need to go further, Taoiseach, and there are actions we could take here at home in passing the Occupied Territories Bill, and actions that your government can take at EU level.
Thanks, Deputy. We have taken considerable actions to date, and we're going to take more. As I mentioned earlier, the Attorney General will represent Ireland at the International Criminal Court in The Hague on the 22nd of February, making the case against the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. We are in discussions with other EU member states about recognising statehood and doing it in a meaningful way. Spain is the main country that we're discussing with that. It wouldn't be fair of me to disclose the names of other countries. It's for them to do that. But suffice to say, Belgium holding the presidency at the moment wouldn't be in a position to do so while they hold the presidency. But Deputy, I really think we need to be honest about the situation that we see unfolding in the Middle East. We will take action. We have taken action. We'll even take more action. But it's very clear to me that the Israeli government doesn't listen to us, doesn't listen to the world, probably doesn't even listen to the Americans anymore. And that's what makes the situation all the more dangerous and all the more worrying. And I think we need to be honest with people about that too, because I am concerned that there are actually people who shout at us and abuse us in the streets. Maybe they don't do it to you, but they certainly do it to me and to my colleagues here who believe there is some action that we can take that will change Benjamin Netanyahu's mind. I think that's incorrect, and I don't think people should spread that idea. I think it's actually irresponsible.
Thank you, Taoiseach. And Deputy Batchik, Deputy Boyd Barrett now, please.
Taoiseach, it's incomprehensible that there is a regime that, after the slaughter that it has inflicted on the people of Gaza for 4 months now, that has claimed the lives of close to 30,000 people, that has displaced almost 2 million people, that has brought an entire population to the brink of famine, and that is in the dock, indicted for genocide, the worst crime a state or human being can commit, that regime is contemplating yet another massacre of the people in Gaza, specifically those in Rafah. More than 1 million people cowering under tents and amid rubble and amid the bodies of the slaughtered and the maimed. And the Israeli regime is planning to do it again. Now, I ask you, what kind of regime is capable of that atrocity? What kind of regime thinks it could get away with a genocide in front of the world, and when it is indicted for genocide, want to continue? And the answer, Taoiseach, is a regime for whom there are never any consequences, ever. Words of criticism, even the quite strong language used by Minister Coveney and others today, means nothing, as you rightly said. Means nothing to Netanyahu, to Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, ministers today in the Israeli government saying we want to destroy Gaza, to add to the litany of incitements to genocide made by that government over the last 4 months. Why do they continue? Why do they think they can do it again? Because there are never any consequences, and the United States continues to give them arms and weapons. European states like Germany and Britain continue to give them arms and weapons, and the European Union gives them favoured trade status, and nobody imposes any sanctions on them. One of the proudest things this country can be proud of is what the Dunnes Stores workers did in the mid-1980s by going on strike for 2 years, forcing Ireland to be the first country in the world to impose comprehensive sanctions on apartheid South Africa, which began a domino effect that led to the dismantling of the apartheid regime. Of course, guess who held out till the bitter end to defend that obnoxious regime? The United States and Britain. Same people who are effectively giving the licence to Israel to continue its atrocities. Be brave. Do what this country did with apartheid South Africa in the mid-1980s that helped bring that regime down. Admit it is an apartheid state, it is an uncivilised state, it is a barbaric state, and that it should have sanctions imposed on it in order to end that apartheid, end that occupation, and end the possibility of the sort of genocidal slaughter we have seen for the last 4 months.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. As I said earlier, there is a ceasefire proposal on the table, negotiated by Egypt, by the Qataris and by the Americans. It is our strong view that Israel and Hamas should both accept that ceasefire proposal. It will allow the killing to stop. It will allow refugees, or at least some of them, to return to their homes. It will allow aid to get in, which is desperately needed by Palestinian civilians. It will also facilitate the release of over 100 Israeli hostages who have been held for more than 3 months now against their will by Hamas. And I believe that if we can secure that 3-month ceasefire, then there's a real possibility of that becoming permanent. That will, of course, require the removal of Hamas leadership and fighters from that territory. And I echo the comments of Minister Coveney earlier today. I do not believe that you respond to a massacre with more massacres. And I do not believe that you can defeat a monster by behaving like a monster yourself. And we will continue to work with our partners in the European Union and other parts of the world to do what we can do that we believe will be effective. In relation to trade sanctions, you'll be aware that trade is an EU competence. It has been since the European Single Act.
Taoiseach, none of the horror that has happened over the last 4 months would have happened if Western governments, including the European Union and the United States, had not given impunity to Israel for years. Long before the current horrific escalation of violence, Israel was indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity, for its occupation, for its apartheid, for its ethnic cleansing, going on for decades. The world didn't sanction them. Your government refused even to use the word apartheid, when it is blatant it's an apartheid regime, when it is blatant that the siege of Gaza was collective punishment of 2 million people, when it is blatant that the Israeli government is engaged in an ongoing campaign of ethnic cleansing. Impunity was given, granted, and that has given Netanyahu and the crazed, bloodthirsty ministers that are his lieutenants the confidence to believe that they can continue with this massacre. So I say we have to impose sanctions on this regime and admit it is not a normal state, that it is an apartheid, colonial, brutal regime, and that if we want to see peace as we do, it has to mean the end of that apartheid regime, where there can be equality between Jewish people, Muslim people, Christian people, and people of no religion who can share the land of Palestine as equals. Anything less, which is we wouldn't accept anywhere else, we didn't accept it in South Africa, it has to be imposed by Western governments, and this government cannot simply say, oh, there's nothing we can do, because that impunity is what has given Israel the licence to continue with this horror.
Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. There are countries in the world that invade other countries, that engage in international terrorism, countries like Russia and Iran, for example, and they don't need the sanction or tacit support of the West or Western countries to do that. So that's a position that you're entitled to hold, but it's not the case that there aren't countries that are anti-West, that don't invade other countries and don't engage in international acts of terrorism, and that's just a simple fact, Deputy. In relation to the single state solution, Deputy, I think that's naive. It's a really nice idea. It might be the kind of thing that you and I would sign up to, being secular people. But it's very, very evident to me that the people of Israel don't want a single state solution. They want a Jewish state, and most Palestinians, many of whom voted for Hamas in the last elections, want an Islamic state. That's the reality of it. And I heard what you said. The West should impose it on them. The West should impose it on them. Isn't that exactly why we have so many problems in the world? Because the West tried to impose its solutions on other parts of the world, whether it was partition, whether it was imposing systems of government that people don't want. It's a funny form of imperialism. They were actually advocating yourself, Deputy, that the West should impose on people in Israel and Palestine a system or a statehood that they don't want.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Mattie McGrath on behalf of the Rural Independent Group.
I wish to highlight again the fact that your government is not properly controlling immigration at Dublin Airport and at all other entry points, which has grave negative consequences. Not arriving at an Irish entry point without documentation breaks the law, and no one is being prosecuted. The government is misleading the public by praising immigration benefits while allowing people without proper ID into the country through a flawed system. This intentional confusion aims to silence criticism. While we all support genuine asylum seekers fleeing persecution, the government's approach makes it hard to distinguish between genuine cases and those exploiting the system. Many asylum seekers are economic migrants, not fleeing for fear of their lives, leading to what's called asylum tourism. Despite being deemed safe countries, the likes of Georgia are sending many asylum seekers to Ireland. The lack of a robust verification process poses a threat to the safety and compromises the asylum process integrity. The government claims all asylum seekers are fingerprinted and checked for criminal records, but this is patently untrue and misleading. 13,521 people seeking asylum have been allowed into Dublin Airport since 2018 without a shred of ID or any documentation. This figure has been confirmed by yourself, Minister for Justice, in a parliamentary reply to me just recently. This is a very serious matter, yet there is no investigation, no consequences, indeed no prosecutions. Allowing unidentified individuals to arrive here without consequences for destroying their travel IDs is not only resulting in exploitation of Irish resources, which are incidentally entirely funded by the taxpayer, but is also undermining the social cohesion. But despite the consequences, this issue is getting worse, not better. The numbers arriving at Dublin airport without any form of ID, despite needing it to board the aircraft on which they arrive here, is skyrocketing under your government. The figures paint a concerning picture of lax immigration controls and serious security risks. For example, in 2018, 895 individuals arrived without any shred of ID. The numbers continued to rise in 2019 with 1,579 undocumented arrivals. Even during the pandemic and challenging times of 2020, when travel was significantly reduced due to the pandemic, 712 individuals arrived with no proper documentation. That's only through Dublin Airport. In 2021, despite ongoing restrictions, 2,982 individuals arrived without travel ID. In 2022, a staggering 4,968 undocumented arrivals were allowed in here that year, and the numbers was 3,000 last year, 3,285. I mean, what's going on? These are not being followed up. The figures highlight that since your government came to office, 11,047 individuals arrived at Dublin Airport without a shred of ID. And that's only Dublin Airport, as I said. And you can make all the statements you like, but this is a simple fact. And these have been absorbed into the iPad system then with some may have criminal records. Well, they have because they broke the law by coming in illegally. And it's just as if they didn't do anything wrong.
Thank you. Taoiseach, please.
Thanks, Deputy. As I said before, and I'll continue to say it, migration is a very sensitive issue and is abused by politicians all over the world in order to gain votes, and often that is based on misinformation and based on hate-mongering, Deputy. So I will say it, and I'll say it again, migration in the round has been a very good thing for Ireland. If it was not for migrants coming here to work in our health service, to build our houses, to look after older people, we wouldn't be able to provide the kind of services we provide now. Far from being the cause of our problems, migration is part of the solution to many of our problems, particularly when it comes to building new homes and running our health and social care services. The major companies that invest in Ireland, that pay billions in tax, that allow us to run our schools, our hospitals, our pension system, wouldn't be here were it not for the fact that they can attract skilled labour from all over the world. Our buses wouldn't run, our restaurants wouldn't operate, our shops wouldn't be open. And I'm going to say that again and again and again anytime anyone raises the issue of migration in this chamber, because I think it's important that we always acknowledge that in the start of any contribution. I hope other members, including opposition members, will at least do that too. In relation to Dublin Airport, Deputy, the number of people coming through Dublin Airport without documents has actually fallen. We've stepped up our activities in that regard. We now have Gardaí in airports in other parts of Europe, working with authorities there. We increasingly check people coming off the planes, not just at border control. We're liaising with airlines to make sure that their staff are properly trained. We have fines which we impose on airlines if they allow people onto aircraft undocumented, and we are seeing a reduction in the number of people coming through Dublin Airport undocumented. We estimate, and we believe based on evidence, that the majority of people who seek international protection in Ireland come across the border from north to south. And I don't think anyone's suggesting that we close the border between north and south. And of course, they go in the other direction too. And that's the reality of the situation. You did say something, Deputy. Two things, Deputy, I think require at least a degree of correction or explanation. 40% of people who apply for international protection get it. Not far off half. So we need to bear in mind that when people see a group of migrants coming into the country, roughly half of them are determined by our system as deserving of international protection. It's not a small minority. It's 40%, not far off half, and that's why we need to make sure that we assess everybody's application fairly if they make it. If somebody comes to an airport without documents, they're sent back. However, if they apply for international protection, well then in that scenario, they're allowed to have their application heard, and heard fairly. Now, unless you're suggesting that we leave the UN and exempt ourselves from international law and become some sort of hermit kingdom, that's going to be continued the case, Deputy, and that's just not common sense. Finally, it's not always the case, Deputy, that people destroy their documents. We don't find destroyed documents in bins or in bathrooms. What happens is they're trafficked into the country, and the person who trafficked them takes the IDs off them at a certain point, probably while they're still on the plane. And we're doing everything we can to crack down on trafficking, and that's why it's so important that we're part of the EU Asylum Pact, because we can only do that on a multilateral basis.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
Taoiseach, I'd be delighted if he answered my question, but he answers a totally different question. And the figures are quoted by the person sitting two away from you there, the Minister for Justice, only last week. And you say the figures are dropping. In 2021, despite ongoing restrictions, 2,982 individuals arrived without travel ID in Dublin Airport. In 2022, 4,968 undocumented arrivals were allowed in. And in last year, 3,285. Are those figures dropping? The figures quoted from the Minister for Justice. You talk about misinformation and disinformation. You should get a gold medal for disseminating disinformation and untruths and downright lies. And we're not talking about anyone coming in or normal migration. We all welcome that, and people that apply to the system. We're talking about people who have broken the law, coming through Dublin Airport, and it's only Dublin Airport, that doesn't mention the ports. And you have the audacity to stand up here there and try and demonise people or anyone that asks. But the public are waiting for you. They see through your lies and your untruths. The figures are quoted by your Minister for Justice, not my figures, not from any paper or anybody else. Minister for Justice figures. Can we trust these figures at all so? If you want to stand up and say that they're all wrong and the figures are dropping, the same as you're talking about hospital trolleys dropping and waiting lists. Will you get real here? Or somebody pinch you and wake up to the fact of what's going on in the country? It's naked blackguarding of our system. People are coming through here with now shredded documentary evidence, which is a crime. And we're prosecuting people for television licenses and God knows what. No flash lamps on their bikes and God knows. And people can walk in here and some at traffic, which is horrific. But very, very few, I believe. And that is horrific if it does. But our country is just a sieve for them here. It's a joke.
Deputy, it's not in order to accuse the Taoiseach or any member of government or any colleague of lying in the House. It is not in order. Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. You were in full flow and you were speaking very quickly, so I may have misunderstood you. But I think I heard you say that the numbers were 4,000 in 2022 and 3,000 in 2023. That's a drop, Deputy. 4,000, 3,000. That's a drop. And I've explained to you exactly why that drop has occurred, because of actions that have been taken by the government. Deputy, if somebody enters the country through Dublin Airport without documents, one of two things happen. Either they get sent back, and that happens all the time. Alternatively, if they apply for international protection, well then they're entitled to have that application assessed, and assessed properly and assessed as quickly as we can, and that is what we do. And Deputy, it's not correct to make the automatic assumption that if somebody enters the country in an undocumented manner, that they've committed a crime. Many of these people, perhaps even most of them, Deputy, are trafficked. That's the truth of it. That's the truth of it. We don't find bins full of destroyed passports or documents. We don't find them flushed down the toilets. Most of these people, Deputy, are trafficked. They actually have been subject to a crime themselves, and you should admit that.
Thank you very much. That concludes Leaders' Questions for today. We move to the order of business. In accordance with Standing Order 35, I ask the Government Chief Whip to move that the arrangements for the week's business be agreed to.
I move.
Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Is that agreed? Deputy Mayor Lou MacDonald.
Ceann Comhairle, Israel acts with impunity and continues its genocidal war on the people of Gaza because it's never held to account by world leaders. Millions of Palestinians, refugees in Rafah, face the same nightmare as those wiped out in Gaza City, and Khan Yunis, before the eyes of the world government, has said that Israel's attack on Rafah is inhumane, that Israel behaves as a rogue state, that Netanyahu isn't listening to anyone. Why then, Taoiseach, is the Israeli ambassador still in Ireland justifying genocide on RTE? It's long past time she was sent packing. It's also time that European states, Britain and the United States stopped arming Israel's genocide. When will we hear that call from government? Ceann Comhairle, I believe the situation is now so dire that we need statements. We need the Minister for Foreign Affairs to present to make a statement, to take questions and to set out very clearly what now the direction of travel will be of the Irish Government on behalf of the Irish state and Irish citizens everywhere.
We've seen reports on RTÉ's primetime that now about 23 properties have been set alight in recent months, and setting these fires has amounted to a form of domestic terrorism, as my colleague Deputy Aodhán Ó Ríordáin has said, and very concerningly, the spate of arson attacks is posing a real and serious threat to human life. In response to a request from Deputy Ó Ríordáin, on the 5th of March, the Garda Commissioner and Minister McEntee will address the Justice Committee on this threat. But Taoiseach, will the Government allocate time in this House also so that we can hear from Government as to how it is proposed to stop these arson attacks before someone is hurt seriously or even killed?
Is it Deputy Councillor Murphy?
Yeah, on the same issue, in terms of the government's approach, and we've heard that there's going to be resources provided in relation to these arson attacks, and probably the best deterrent is seeing people brought to justice where they're actually detected and they're prosecuted. But that will require a strategy, and where the social media platforms, for example, have a huge role to play in the spread of information and disinformation. And the policing approach to that is something I've got some questions about. But before we do see somebody hurt or injured, and it maybe the building is empty, we're asking firefighters to go in, neighbouring buildings are compromised. We need a debate on where those resources are being deployed and what is the approach that government intends to take to arrest this issue.
Deputy Boyd Barrett? No?
Do you want to give the Taoiseach a chance to answer? No. Sorry. Taoiseach, the Planning and Development Bill, the second biggest piece of legislation that has ever gone through this House, and which deals with critical issues to do with delivery of housing, the right of communities to participate in the planning and development of their area, the right of communities and individuals to have access to justice when it comes to community planning and development issues, and so much more, is being dealt with in the committee. And all of the opposition spokespeople, possibly others that I know, are deeply unhappy that we are being asked to deal in a very condensed period with, I think it's about 1,200 amendments that we're going to have, I think it's 20 or 30 hours to consider these this week, where, to be honest, it is not possible in that time frame, to deal with the complexity and the number of amendments with this critically important bill. And opposition spokespeople have asked that it would be spread out more to make it possible to deal with this critical piece of legislation that deals with housing, planning, development and democracy, essentially.
Deputy McGrath?
John Kohler, the bill is 700 pages long. The number of amendments are enormous, and to be pushing this through here with so little time, it affects every man, woman and child all over the country, urban and rural. And indeed people are at Tavenmoha and talking enough from the Gaeltacht area, protesting at the way they're being mistreated by the planning regulations. A lot of people had hope for this new legislation, but now it is so enormous and so little time to tease it out, it's going to be fraught with problems. It'll only make money for one lot of people, and that is the liars down across the river in the courts, because it's rushed and it's not properly debated or discussed in here, and I think that's bad for democracy any day of the week. So we all had hope that it would change some of the guidelines, it would give better clarity, but it's not doing that, and it's going to be a confused piece of legislation.
Thank you.
We need a debate on it.
Nobody else? Taoiseach, please.
Thanks to deputies for the contributions once again. It's not the practice of the government to expel ambassadors, and we still need to be able to speak to the Israeli ambassador about two things. First of all, Irish citizens who are still caught up in Gaza, and secondly, the safety of our troops on the border with Lebanon and on the Golan Heights. And I have a responsibility as Taoiseach to think about the safety of our citizens and indeed our troops on the borders of Israel. In relation to arson, arson is a serious crime, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Guard investigations are underway. We expect that there will be prosecutions, and I agree that we need to see prosecutions and convictions. But I have to say it is deeply ironic that people who oppose migration, who connect migration with criminal activity are indeed the criminals themselves, carrying out the very serious crime of arson. And I have to say, while I think many protesters may very well be decent people and good people, I don't believe that protesters who spend the entire day and the entire night outside a building didn't see anything before the building burnt down, and they need to be held accountable for their silence and complicitness as well, in my view. On the Planning and Development Bill, our intention is to have that bill enacted before the summer recess. That gives us about 4 to 5 months to do it. I would hope that's enough time for us in this House to deal with the matter. It is linked to the housing crisis. I think it should be doable in that time schedule. In relation to statements, again, happy to have statements on any of the matters the deputies raised. I don't think we have a statement on Garda strategy, but we certainly could have a statement on the issue of arson and the attacks on buildings more widely. I won't even say proposed migration centres, because some of them were never even proposed for that purpose. But I think that should be agreed by the Business Committee.
Now, are the proposals for the arrangements for this week agreed to? Agreed. Na teach the Tarhaven at Harishkana, British Taw, and a Gwynna, Neil. Stolen Gilling Cash Rich. I believe the question is carried. Vote all. Seats, members, please. Designated seats. Proposal on the order of business. The question is that the proposed arrangements for the week's business be agreed to, and on that question a division has been challenged. Tellers Thaw, Minister Hildegard Naughton and Deputy Cormac Devlin, Neil, Deputy Mattie McGrath and Deputy Michael Healy-Rae. Shinna Thaw, Shaskashak, Neil, Craigashay, near Stainania. So Tagonona Shachtana Sukreha. We move now to questions on promised legislation. Can we have a little hush, please? Please. On promised legislation, Deputy Thomas Gould.
Taoiseach, it is time to scrap the TV licence. In the wake of the financial scandals at RTE and more than 100,000 people who haven't paid their TV licence, it is now time for it to go. Public support for the licence has collapsed, and the idea that the state would chase thousands of people through the courts is frankly absurd. You yourself have described the TV licence as outdated and that we need a new funding model that works. Sinn Féin's motion tonight proposes that the licence fee be scrapped and we replace it with direct exchequer funding to fund public service media and broadcasting in the state. Taoiseach, I'm urging you to scrap the TV licence and to fund public service broadcasting directly.
Taoiseach, please.
Thanks, Deputy. I agree that the TV licence is outmoded. However, it remains the law, and I encourage people to comply with the law and continue to pay it. It's not just about RTE, it's about other forms of public service broadcasting, Irish language programming, and indeed programming for children and the arts. Government will make a decision this year on a new funding model. It'll either be a household charge collected by revenue or exchequer funding. But I have to say, Deputy, I had a chance to read your policy, and yeah, it's a nice picture of you and Pierce here, and it's like it's pretty comical. I'm sorry to say that, but it is. Parts of it are copy and pasted from the Future of the Commission Media report. I think your proposal to introduce an amnesty for people who didn't pay is deeply insulting to people who comply with the law and do pay. Just think about all those people who collect the stamps or who pay their bills and have done so for years. I think it's an insult and a kick in the teeth to them. And the oddest thing in the policy is this proposal that you would continue to pay 12.5 million a year to An Post for not collecting the charge when it's abolished. I'm all for supporting An Post, but giving people 12 million a year to collect a charge that doesn't exist anymore really is comical.
Deputy Batchik, please.
Taoiseach, news broke today that the latest attempt to curb HSE overspending involves plans to cut €250 million on outside staffing agencies, and we know that the cost of hiring healthcare staff from for-profit agencies increased by 139% between 2015 and 2022 to €619 million. Taoiseach, the HSE should be directly employing nurses, midwives and doctors and not over-relying on agencies. One agency healthcare worker affected by the current recruitment freeze said to me about agency work, every day is like your first day on the job. It doesn't make sense to move around all the time. We are paid the same and a private company takes the cream off the top. So Taoiseach, we in Labour are concerned that the HSE plans to suddenly turn off the tap with sizeable cuts could risk patients' health, especially this winter. So will you ensure that the safety of patients is the marker of success, and indeed to save money and secure better care for patients as well as decent conditions for healthcare workers, will you move to end the foolish recruitment freeze within the HSE?
Thanks, Deputy. The HSE hired 8,000 extra staff last year, probably the biggest increase in a very long time, and the HSE service plan next year provides for the HSE to hire an additional 2,000 to 3,000 staff. I don't know what your definition of a recruitment freeze is, but 8,000 extra staff last year and another 2,000 or 3,000 this year to me is not a recruitment freeze, but it isn't going to be the free-for-all that we've seen in previous years, and it can't be and it shouldn't be. As part of the plans, there'll also be 400 more beds opened between community and acute hospitals, provision for waiting lists to fall again this year, third year in a row, and some of the savings will come from a reduction in agency staff.
Deputy Holly Kearns.
Taoiseach, last year Rafah was home to around 250,000 people, and now there are 1.5 million people in Rafah because Palestinians were told to go there and they would be safe. And yesterday morning, Israeli airstrikes targeted Rafah, killing dozens of people. The targeting of Rafah is a massive escalation in Israel's invasion of Gaza. That requires a change in approach from our government. I'm wondering what actions are you taking as a result of that? You mentioned that you contacted the European Commission President on the EU-Israel trade agreement. Can you update us? What happened in the conversation and what are you going to do next?
Thanks, Deputy. We'll continue to do what we've done to date, use our voice and our vote at the UN and the EU in support of the Palestinian people, increase funding for agencies like UNRWA when other countries have suspended their funding. We are working with other countries on the possibility of statehood and recognition. We've called very clearly for the EU-Israel Association Agreement to be on the table because we believe that Israel may have breached the Human Rights Clause on that. We will continue to do all of these things, and we will also continue to call for both Israel and Hamas to accept the ceasefire proposal that's on the table, and I'd strongly encourage both sides to do so.
Boyd Barrett.
Taoiseach, People Before Profit published a plan for the funding of RT and public broadcasting in August of last year, and it was obvious at that stage that there was a funding crisis. The TV licence has always been a regressive charge, and then after the governance issues and the Turbidity scandal, it was obvious this could not work. But you haven't made a decision. And the consequence is that 13,000 people get dragged through the courts for a regressive charge that is not viable and that has to go. It is clear that the workers and jobs are going to be the collateral damage in RTE, because they're talking about job suppression, and that is going to mean good jobs are going to be privatised and outsourced, and the quality of public service broadcasting will be degraded. It will hit precisely arts, culture, entertainment. You need to scrap the TV licence and bring in a digital tax to directly fund RT and public service broadcasting.
Thanks, Deputy. We're not going to be introducing a digital tax. Ireland is a hub for digital, and we have huge investments and huge numbers of people working in digital and tech in Ireland, and I don't want to undermine that by imposing a tax on them. There are levies for regulation, but that's a different thing. We've also provided emergency funding to RTE precisely because we want to protect employment there and continue to fund public service broadcasting, but that's not sustainable into the medium term. I accept that. We will make a decision on a new funding model this year. It'll either be a household charge collected by the revenue or exchequer funding, and we'll make that decision this year. In the meantime, the TV licence remains the means by which public service broadcasting is funded. It's not just about RT, it is the law, and I encourage people to comply with the law.
Deputy Cathal-Berry, please.
And good afternoon, Taoiseach. Taoiseach, my question this afternoon is in relation to the National Development Plan. I understand that there may be additional resources being made available for the National Development Plan sometime this year. So I guess my questions are, do we know how much additional money will be put on the table? And if so, when will we know the individual allocations for each line department? Thank you very much, John. Thanks, Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. The capital budget for this year, that's money invested in public infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads, transport, is 13 billion. That's 4 times the amount than when I was first appointed to government in 2011, so that's the extent to which we've ramped up investment in public infrastructure in recent years. The additional amount to be allocated is 2.25 billion over the course of the next 3 years. Minister Donoghue is currently in negotiations with ministers about how that will be allocated into which departments. As you can imagine, ministers have ideas and bills attached to them that run to many multiples of 2.25 billion, but 'twas always thus. But we'd expect those allocations to be ready to be confirmed next month, most likely in March.
Thank you. Deputy McGrath.
We're currently seeing a significant decline in rural health services across Ireland.